Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as usual by Tucker Hazel, and we're here today to do something quite interesting, I would say. We're here to,
Ideally, all our videos fall into
uh,
that category. But
you know what? Sometimes we phone it in.
yeah,
I'm not
but
gonna lie. He's not gonna lie.
this
But
time we'll see.
what we're gonna do instead is something that's gonna
Hello?
involve. It's gonna involve your help, and I'm not pointing at Tucker. I'm pointing at you, the audience member, because today we're gonna answer a fairly ephemeral question, and it might sound crazy, but we're gonna discuss what makes an old game old?
Yeah.
And we can't do it alone because we don't have any answers. We basically have a starting point. We
hmm
want you to give us your perspectives, both in the comments section, but also in the Discord. Link as usual, top of the description or down there. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and hang out with us. Because we do a lot of faffing about,
Oh yeah.
but intellectual faffing about.
Sure. Yeah. Make
Yeah,
that into a shirt. Make it into a bumper
right,
sticker. I'm an intellectual faffer.
right.
I really
And we
hope that's not a word I shouldn't be saying. Faffer.
we talk sort of in sort of broad strokes about games, right? And we want to do that with
Oh.
you
Oh. Okay.
today.
Actually, no. That makes sense.
Is it
A
okay?
faffer is someone who wastes time doing unnecessary things.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. That makes
That's
sense.
true. Most of the time I spend on the Discord is because I should be doing something else I don't want to be doing.
True. Yeah.
So
Join
come
us. Do that exact
procrastinate
same
with us.
thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But Tucker, I need you to take my hand for a moment here. Because what makes an old game old? I interpret this question you posed to me in one
Yeah.
way, but I'm curious what this prompt principally means to you.
Yeah, it's something that I think about quite often as I am one to play random older games, whether that is a 90s game, an 80s game, something on SNES Online, NES Online, play a Genesis game. I have dabbled in my fair share of Atari games, older arcade games, and there's a lot of these older games that I find hard to get into. But that people who grew up with them or who very experienced in this era of games love the design of the
Right.
what I would say are antiquated elements of some NES games, arcade games, are very big turnoffs to me. And game
Yeah.
design has changed a lot. And we're not talking about old. I don't mean like, okay, yeah, this game came out 35 years ago.
Right.
It's old in that regard. But in terms of how design philosophies have changed since then, there are certainly elements of older games that make them feel distinct from newer games and can make someone who's not experienced with those older games, such as me, though I have played a good number of them, make those big turnoffs from wanting
Yeah.
to get a high score in something like Galago or really push through and get good at a game like Mega Man or Castlevania. These are games that I respect, I think are interesting, are foundational, but certain elements of them keep me from wanting to dive in. But there are people who disagree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
In our server, one Mr. Brogan Chatton has had multiple conversations with me about the design of something like Castlevania that I consider to be antiquated in an unfair and unfun way. But
Yeah.
and many people can attest to that who are experienced with that kind of game design think that it's phenomenally designed and oh that doesn't make any sense why would you think that kind of thing so I think that gap is interesting and something that I think about quite often as I try to be as objective as I can when thinking about game design but there are elements that work for some people and don't for others and I think that's how I post this. What was your interpretation though?
Yeah, I think mine was largely similar. Because when I think of the idea, what makes an old game old,
Yeah.
it sort of invites in my opinion, the inverse statement, which is what makes an old game new, and not old or
Okay.
new as in as you're saying time scale, but
Release date.
old,
Yeah.
yeah, old or new as in feel.
Yes. Exactly.
Because there's a lot
Exactly.
of old games, I mean old in this case in a time sense, that feel like they could have released nowadays.
Yeah.
I know one you played not recently, but in the last year or so that you felt this way about, I believe, is like Yoshi's Island.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yoshi's Island is an excellent example of a platformer that, sure, is from 1994 and is very of its era, but nonetheless is not really constrained by it. And I think really the heart of this discussion is probably those constraints
hmm
and sort of the affordances of those constraints in a way.
Yeah.
Because I think an important part of this whole conversation is like difficulty.
Sure. Yes.
And
Absolutely.
difficulty, I think this comes back to the kind of constraints and affordances idea, because part of the reason that a lot of like NES games are so hard is because there was no space in that cartridge.
Yeah.
You,
You can only have a certain amount of levels,
yeah, there's
a
very
certain
few,
amount of enemies on screen at a time.
yeah, I mean, there's very few NES games that you can't beat in 2 hours or less, right?
Hmm. If
Um,
you know what you're doing, yeah.
and that's the point, because sure, it might only take 45 minutes to an hour to get through Ninja Gaiden, but you're going to need, unless you're using Rewind or something, as we both did when we played that game,
Hmm.
you're going to need probably your entire summer of whatever that game came out, like early 90s. You need that
Yeah.
entire summer to learn the game and figure it out. And so I think it's important just materially to understand the differences between eras and sort of how that informed game design and sort of how that inherently makes something feel old now, because
Yeah.
difficulty now is sort of a is an option.
Hmm.
Literally,
Yes.
every game has a difficulty option because you have no constraint. You can make a 20-hour long game, and it
Hmm.
doesn't matter. You don't need to
I
pad out.
believe I've heard word that there are games longer than that.
Unfortunately,
Not that I would play them, but what,
yeah,
26 hours? I think is maybe the max.
I believe so.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of interesting components just in this idea of physically what you could put into your game that informs the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that even goes back a little farther than that, which is a lot of the game design tenets of something like a Mario Brothers or a Ninja Gaiden or Castlevania or Mega Man come from what game design was at the time and had been for the entire history of video games, which was arcade games. And is that you're
Yeah,
gonna put in a quarter and it's gonna be hard as crap, but if you keep playing, if you keep putting in your quarters, you keep running out of lives, you keep trying, you're going to learn this game and be able to master it sometime.
yeah,
And that's why games like Dig Dug and Pac-Man and Galaga are as iconic as they are and as foundational, but they are based around a payment scheme that has not existed for most of games history at this point. There are still arcade games, but arcade style games are and have been becoming less and less popular as time has gone on, as people like you and me who are born not growing up solely on arcades and with the experience of 5th gen, 6th gen games that are largely entirely divorced from those kind of design tenets. The element that sticks out to me most as sticking around for, in my opinion, longer than it should have is the lives system. And the
yeah.
lives in an arcade game, as I said, are a constraint of they don't want someone to be playing for 6 hours unless they're good enough. You put your quarter on the marquee, you run out of lives, and okay, it's the next person's turn. But then you transition to something like Mario Brothers or Mario 2, Mario 3, Mario World. These are games that have lives, not because necessarily the game needed to have lives, but that's because that's what people knew. And getting a one up lets you continue for a little longer. It incentivizes exploration. But lives for me are an element that still pervade in some games to this day that I think
Um,
are that have been antiquated and unnecessary for 20 years plus at this point. And I was playing a game, I'm not going to say which game because it's a secret game that I'm not going to say until BLB, but I was playing a game that had a live system and I ran out of lives in that game because I only had like 4 and then I died a couple times and I ran out of lives and I got a game over and then I just respawned at the hub world and I started the level over again and it was like nothing had happened. It just added 20 seconds to my game time, which is not a lot, but it is an element of game design that is entirely superfluous. When the consequence for losing all your lives is getting kicked back out to the hub world, selecting level, and trying again, that is not something that needs to be around at all, and it's not involved in that game's design, which I think is a very interesting element of game design that made this game that I was playing feel old and basically just that way, but it was still, I don't know, like, you only included this because older games did, not because it's actually helpful to the game that you're designing now.
so that's a really good point, but I got distracted because now I know what this game is. Can I just make the guess and will you promise to answer it
Sure.
truthfully if I'm right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, it's Galaxy 2, right?
Yeah, it is Galaxy 2. Yeah.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, I figured. I've been thinking about this last couple days, and because you said the clue that really gave it away until this point was that the game was notoriously not on Switch.
Yes, I knew that would be a fun hint. It's specifically not on the Switch.
Yeah, yeah, I figured that's then the live thing. Yeah, but you're right, I was thinking about Mario in the context of this, because obviously Odyssey dropped the live system,
Yeah.
for the better, but I was also recently playing Return to Dreamland Deluxe, which
Hmm.
has a life system.
Yeah,
Um,
but you have 70 lives by the end of that game.
yeah, I think I beat it. I beat it with 70 plus lives.
Exactly.
Um, and it's an interesting point because there are definitely these sort of vestigial design elements that stick around,
Yeah.
and lives are probably maybe the biggest.
Yeah.
Um, and we're finally starting to see most platformers dip away from them.
Yeah.
I would say that the like the presence of lives in like Mario Brothers One on
Yeah.
NES does make a lot of sense because I think
A little bit. Yeah. A little
that
more. But
again speaks to this idea of difficulty lengthening
of
of
course.
because Mario One you can beat in what 20 minutes if you're
Hmm.
doing warp zones or whatever. It's a very very short game, and the level design is not even either that complex or that challenging, right? So it's
Hmm.
add in the life system to give some sort of pressure. I think
Sure.
that makes sense, but when you get to modernity, as you're saying, and you're playing a game like 3D World, how about
Yeah.
where if you
Yeah.
die enough times, you get the golden Tanuki suit
Hmm.
to beat basically kind of beat the level for you, or in the case of New Super Mario Brothers Wii,
Or
you
even
die enough
Galaxy
time.
2.
Yeah,
There's like Galaxy Rosalina that just literally takes over, possesses your character, and beats
forgot
the
about
level
that.
for you. I only did
Yeah,
that once because I just wanted to see what it was like.
yeah, that's the same in New Super Mario Brothers Wii, where Luigi will just beat the level for you, also.
Hmm.
Um, and it makes me wonder, like, it feels like it feels like you're not really using the correct design element here,
Yeah.
because ultimately, what do the lives do? In Kirby, they do nothing.
No.
In Galaxy, they're basically in New Super Mario Brothers a way to count the number of times you die before the game just does a challenge for you,
Yeah. Sure.
and it's just not quite sensible, I don't
Hmm.
think. And I think on sort of a larger scale, beyond just a lives point, a lot of what makes an old game feel old is when these ideas that no longer feel sensible are being presented to us in a modern era.
Yeah. Sure.
That to me is when an old game feels old. Again, in the case of Ninja Gaiden, when you contextualize that within its period, as we talked about when we talked about this game many years ago,
Hmm.
it feels very cutting edge
Sure.
in
Yeah.
terms of its presentation of narrative. But then in terms of the punishing difficulty or the respawning enemies,
Yeah.
that didn't matter. That was not at all a consideration in the NES era. Of course, the game is unforgiving. Of course, the enemies respawn
Yeah.
because the hardware
Kick
has
back
to
to the beginning
respawn
of the
them.
level
Right.
when you die. Yeah.
Those things just made sense. They were of their time, just in the ways that lives now are not of our time.
Hmm.
Those elements are of the late 80s and early 90s. But it's when you take that forward to this time when those ideas don't make sense anymore that the game begins to feel old.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree, and that
Yeah,
was kind of the crux of why I was thinking about it with
yeah,
Galaxy 2, and you're right about Return of Dreamland Deluxe, another game that I just finished, and lives, there's no pressure there. The vestigial element is that it's fun to get the mini dopamine rush of diddling, you got a one up, and or
it
you
is
get an
fun.
extra life in Kirby, but they don't do anything. They just incentivize exploration or
Yeah,
collecting of coins or little star pieces or whatever it is in Kirby to get a one up that you're never gonna need, but it's just a dopamine rush
yeah,
that could possibly help someone if they're bad enough at Kirby that they're dying 30 times on each stage. Um, but yeah, yeah, that's the element that sticks out most to me. And with other games from say the NES era that have those antiquated design constraints because of the hardware, I do think about something like Kid Icarus, which is a game that you and I both played
yeah,
recently that has a lot of early gen design ideas. Of course, there are lives in there, but there's also a password system that has since been long gone. There's
right.
also the when screen goes up, you cannot fall down or you will die. Same with Mario Bros. 1, you can't go back. But that's because
Yeah,
they hadn't developed the technology. Well, I guess they had developed the technology to do that because Metroid
I think
obviously
it's
was
a
a
memory
experimented
issue.
with. Yeah, yeah, but that's something that was fixed 3 years later, and
Yeah,
you had games not even need to worry about that anymore. And that it's elements like that, or restarting a level completely, or being kicked back to the beginning of a game that combined with the respawning enemies or the speed of enemies versus the speed of your character, that makes games like Mega Man or Castlevania or Ninja Gaiden fun for me to look at as a historical curiosity or to play through with rewind so I can avoid that kind of challenge being annoying to me, but in a way that for someone who did not grow up with them, they feel unfair of an enemy
Yeah.
respawning randomly after I kill it just from off screen or jumping off screen and attacking me because there literally was not enough like screen real estate on the system to make it fair enough to where you can really see what's coming ahead. Those elements make it very hard for me to want to engage in a game because they do feel antiquated because games have long since moved past that kind of design.
Yeah, they have, but I think it speaks in part to sort of the unique affordance of interactivity in games.
Yeah.
You think about a lot of the films we watch for Quest for the Besties, for instance.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's an important idea because sort of the ways that, let's say, Super Mario Brothers 3 is a masterpiece of its era,
Yeah.
a film like Casablanca is a masterpiece of its era, right?
Hmm.
But Casablanca, there's no difficulty to revisiting it
Sure.
because ultimately story structure, performance, editing, all these things
Yeah.
that you don't have to directly interface with them. So it
Hmm.
doesn't really matter how these techniques progress. It doesn't matter that
Yeah.
cameras have gotten better since 1940. It doesn't matter that editing techniques are more advanced. Any
Hmm.
of it's all aesthetic. You think about basically any other artistic medium, the sort of progression is largely aesthetic.
That's true.
And
It's interesting to think about the time
yeah,
scale, and of course, that is what causes video games to have
right,
this difference in growth over the last few years. You think about let's go back to I don't know the year negative 400.
sure,
Sculpture, it's a new thing. I don't know when sculpture went. Of course, it was older than that, but sculpture is just becoming a thing. Somebody makes like a pile of clay on the ground. They're like, this is what we call a sculpture. And all the people in ancient Babylon or whatever, are like, well, this is revolutionary. I can't imagine this. And
yeah,
then 15 years after that, that sculpture's got some arms and the nose, and they're like, man, oh, look at that old pile of clay. That was decades ago. That's antiquated. But we've had thousands and thousands of years of
yeah.
sculpture or painting or music that have evolved in small ways in different eras as different aesthetic and cultural elements come in and out. But games have only existed for 45 years, and it's like us watching music start from somebody discovering that a note makes a note, and then to where we are to get today in terms of the evolution of games. I think that time scale is what's really interesting. It'll be impossible for us because we will not live long enough to see video games become something that's been around as long as music or sculpture or painting has. But 500 years from now, games will have only had a blip on the timeline where arcade games or NES games or Super Nintendo games had that game design philosophy, and 99.9% of history will have entirely forgotten about that. And I think that's a really interesting thing that we we haven't had the chance to really think about yet, of these vestigial arcade punishing NES game
Yeah.
elements are going to be just a blip in what game design has the potential to be.
I think you're right, but I want to return to your clay example, my Casablanca example for a second, because even in the case of your two clay sculptures, this really basic, primitive, early clay sculpture and the more advanced one, a spectator can still look at both and appreciate both with the same level of physical ease.
Yeah.
And you can look at that pile of mud and like twigs and shit and animal bone and say, isn't it so interesting what this was? And isn't it
Yeah.
so impressive for its time?
Though,
And
by the way,
isn't
I was not comparing Casablanca to the pile of
no,
mud.
no, no,
I
I
would be
agree. I agree.
comparing like the earliest forums of like moving pictures, like a
Yeah.
Lumiere short, to then what Georges Méliès brings 20 years later. Like that's the evolution I'm talking about. Movies
Yeah.
have been relatively the same aesthetically and editing wise for since then, but yeah, it's the
Yeah.
beginning. It's the seed of a growth of an artistic medium that I was trying to draw a comparison to there.
Yeah, no, and that's fair, but I think at the same time it's also important to remember that like the sculpture, even as the first sculpture and the sculpture that somebody finished yesterday, you can appreciate in the exact same way.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean to say I mean that on a physical level. I mean that
Hmm.
visually. It's the same with it's the same with film. You just need these peepers and these receivers,
Yeah.
and you can appreciate Casablanca in the exact same physical way that you appreciate Coda. How about?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
go watch our reviews of those movies, and you'll see
yeah.
especially your difference in
Hmm.
enjoyment of those two films.
But that's not true of games.
Yeah.
Because not only, as you're saying, are we in this moment where the acceleration of technology is so incredible that the ways we engage with an experience now make the old ones look incredibly old,
Mm-hmm.
they now also feel incredibly old.
Yeah.
And that feel is a really important point of this conversation, and I think why we're centralizing the idea of oldness as a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the particulars of this medium, old things, you can't appreciate them just for their historical significance or design in the same way that you could Casablanca, or even like watching the 7 seconds of arrival at a train station, right?
Yeah.
Um, you have to play Kid Icarus.
Yeah.
And playing Kid
Unfortunately.
Icarus, unfortunately, is not a satisfying experience. And watching Kid Icarus, a video of Kid Icarus, is not the same as playing it.
Of course. Yeah.
So you can't escape this idea that playability is so key. And our standards for playability keep changing
Mm-hmm.
to the point where I even think Twilight Princess feels old.
Sure. Not a game
And
that I have an experience with, but
yeah,
could you speak on any elements of that feel antiquated in that way?
yeah, because when Twilight Princess came out, a large part of its appeal is that it modernized Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Field
Mm-hmm. Sure.
to make an open space in Zelda game feel new.
Mm-hmm.
But you play Twilight Princess now, and that Hyrule Field is completely empty.
Yeah.
And by that merit, it feels very old
Yeah.
because the gulf
And
of
it's very
interact.
apparent that hey,
Yeah,
the hardware limitations, the memory limitations of the Wii, the complexity of the environments that they're designing are not on the level that we're used to today. And frankly, they weren't even up to the standards of what open worlds could do at the time. Just a few years later, you'd get something like Far Cry 3 or the Assassin's Creed games that have a lot more complexity. Of course, there's different kinds of games, different developers, but that element I agree, and
yeah,
it's part of the reason why something like Ocarina of Time, which is widely held to be
yeah,
one of the greatest games ever made, as someone like me, which I usually am, I play that game and I'm able to respect it, but there are certain elements of it that
yeah.
do feel antiquated. And Hyrule Field is a prime example of that. Of
Right.
hey, there's basically nothing to do here. You could cut down like the three blades of grass that exist scattered around the entire thing, but there's very little reason for it to be there other than the base idea of this area is physically large or larger than you're used to at this point in time. But it feels like padding. It feels empty. It feels like wasted space when you go back and play that game today.
And I think this is an interesting direction to the conversation, and because then the question becomes, if a game feels old,
Mm-hmm.
does that then make it bad? Or
Yeah.
is the oldness a negative?
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I think it's very complicated, because for me, the answer is no.
Okay.
I don't for instance, I think Ninja Gaiden is a 4 out of 5 star game.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that it feels incredibly, incredibly old.
Yeah. And what's
For,
interesting about something like that, using that as a specific example, again, that both of
yeah,
us played a couple of years ago at this point, we
yeah,
both liked it. You liked it a little bit more than I did.
yeah,
But the reason that you were able to appreciate that game's design elements and what was forward
right,
thinking is because of the modern affordances of Nintendo Switch Online Rewind. I
sure,
think that if you had just been given a cartridge of Ninja Gaiden and told, hey, play through this game, it would have
yeah,
taken you a week, a couple weeks, depending on how much time you're putting into it each day.
yeah,
But I don't know if you would have liked that game anywhere near as much if you weren't able to go past the things and avoid the things that made it feel old. It didn't feel old because you were like, okay, oh, an enemy jumped at me off screen. The knockback is ridiculous. This platform, the collision detection is a little bit off. I can just get rid of those. I can just be like, okay, well, I know where it's coming. I'll rewind, hit it. I can move on to the next thing. But
yeah,
if you didn't have that, I do think that would have been a negative. I don't think you would have enjoyed the game as much because who knows if you would even have beaten it at that
yeah,
point because you are someone who was born after the game came out.
right,
The games you grew up with didn't have that kind of difficulty, those kind of memory constraints, that kind of design. That gameplay experience doesn't necessarily work for you as much. It might work. It probably works for you a little better than it works for me. I'm
yeah,
not the kind of guy that gravitates towards specifically, and why when it gets to my turn to answer this question, I
Yeah.
would say yes, that is a negative for me. But the reason you were able to appreciate it is because of the modern forms, not necessarily because of the game's design itself.
That's a fair point. So let's scratch Ninja Gaiden point for a second.
Okay, all right.
Let's use Sin and Punishment. How about?
Okay, sure.
Because Sin and Punishment is a game that I have played a lot of and don't need to rewind to play.
Sure.
But Sin and Punishment,
Though you probably use save states at first because you have it on Wii U, correct?
I never used them. I never had to use them. But I also had played a lot of like Star Fox at that
Sure,
point,
sure. Yeah,
so the gulf and is not was not that big for me.
sure. Yeah, yeah.
But Sin and Punishment is actually there's one boss I remember having to use save states on, but it's unimportant. The line the point is, if I were to replay Ninja Gaiden right now, I would need to use save states.
Yeah.
Not the case for Sin and Punishment.
Mm-hmm.
To me, Sin and Punishment, zooming out a second, does feel very old.
Yeah.
It feels
Okay.
very old in the sense that the game is 45 minutes long. It's clearly designed around arcade tenets.
Yeah.
And obviously, on a presentational level, it's very much of the N64 era, despite it
Yeah.
looking far closer to a PS1 game than it does an
Sure.
N64 game in a
Yeah.
lot of respects.
Very impressive game for that hardware.
Yeah. But there's no doubt that the sum of Sin and Punishment's parts does feel old in certain respects. But Sin and Punishment is interesting because I also think there's a lot that feels new about it. I think the movement feels quite good. I think that the gameplay loop feels quite good. But ultimately, speaking purely to the old elements, I don't think that that's a negative against the game because I don't think that newness is the new metric inherently for goodness.
I 100% agree with that, yeah.
And I think that just because we play games that aren't up to the standards of interactivity of new titles doesn't mean that they are worse because of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Sin and Punishment is in no way hampered by its antiquated design elements. Ocarina of Time is another really interesting example.
Yeah.
Because I actually wrote a piece comparing Ocarina of Time to Metropolis and the role of the interactivity and how interactivity shapes our understanding of, throughout time, a piece of art remaining the best of its medium.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I don't think that Ocarina of Time anymore can be considered the best game of all time. But I also don't think, by merit of it feeling old because Hyrule Field is empty or various things, that it is worse for it. I think that there's a great degree of contextualization you need to play these games. And for me, on a subjective level, when I contextualize these games' oldnesses, be it mechanical, presentational, whatever, in the context of this era, it's no longer a negative.
Yeah, that is an element that I have trouble wrestling with within myself, within my experience of some of these older games. Something like playing Mario World, which is a game that has been still to this day held up as one of the greats. I mean, it's a game that you and I played, and we liked it. It was good, but because it had
no Mario 3.
It's a great point. We both do like that game a little bit more. Because the elements of that game have become widely just like, you expect that. The revolutionary elements of something like Mario 3, Mario World, that is choosing a bunch of your own path through a world map, saving a couple items in your inventory, uses power-ups later. These are elements that were revolutionary at the time, but it's hard for us to experientially contextualize that. We can factually contextualize that, like, this was new, but it is not like, oh my god, I can't believe they did this. I can't believe there's a world map where I can select this level or that level. I've never even conceptualized that before. That is something that cannot be recreated in an experience, and it can't factor into my experience with the game of, wow, this really puts it above what I'm playing today. Games that handle a little better, look obviously a little better. The visuals, that's not even really a part of this conversation for me in terms of, we're talking about feel. I find it hard to... I contextualize games in the time they came out in terms of their importance. But in terms of my engagement with them, the interactivity, which, as we're saying, I do think is the most important aspect of these games, you and I are in a very small minority that, know the history of these games, seek out these games to know their history, are able to contextualize them within that history because we have that kind of knowledge. But for the majority of players, and I think that I fit into this camp in terms of my personal enjoyment, old games feeling old is a negative because they don't retain certain design elements that I am used to, that I would personally pretend are portend, not pretend, are superior to what was before because
Yeah.
I enjoy them more. And it's something that is very subjective. It's about experience, but people like things because they are what shaped them. They are designed in certain ways
Yeah.
that interact with their tastes in certain ways, and taste is something that you can't necessarily uh,
Right.
account for in terms of, is this well designed? Is this, does this feel old? Do you have experience with this? Do you not? That is something that I can't really like retroactively insert into my personal experience with the game, because when I play Mario World, I'm like, yeah, this is a good game and it was impressive for its time, but I'm not going to put it against my favorite 2D platformers of now because it feels older. These elements aren't as impressive as they were at the time. Same with Ocarina of Time. I would say that it being empty is a negative to that experience because I'm walking through Hyrule Field and it's not engaging at all. I'm like, this is a boring part of this game. It is taking
Yeah.
down my experience with this game. If this area had things to do with it do in it, like Breath of the Wild does in its open areas, I would be more engaged. I would be more interested in what this game's doing. But because it is older, it doesn't have that affordance, and that does put it squarely below something like Breath of the Wild. And I'm not saying that you think Ocarina of Time is better than Breath of the Wild, but there are
Yeah.
people who do. But I think that it is an element of a lot of these games being held still as some of the greatest of all time are because a lot of the people making those decisions grew up with those games and have that in the back of their mind experience of seeing Ocarina of Time or Mario 64 and being like,
Yeah.
oh my god, a 3D game. Isn't this impressive? This looks like a cartoon. And now we play Mario 64 and we're like, okay, the camera's a little janky. Obviously, it doesn't hold up amazingly visually, so it is dated visually. But there are elements of what was your experience with it at the time that I think can't be retroactively added to the majority of people's experiences because they weren't around at that time. And that's why there's a disconnect for me.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying, but ultimately, like, I have no interest, for the sake of this conversation, what anybody other than you or me thinks about it, because
Yeah,
frankly,
yeah.
most people are stupid and they don't know anything about games.
I totally agree. Including most people on our Discord server.
Um, uh, and I think to bring my personal perspective back to the foreground, because this is
Yeah.
a very subjective point. Um, we've been talking a lot about Metroid because Nintendo, remember that they own Metroid since 2017 about.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and we're in a major Metroid moment right now. And I've been talking a lot about, you made this interesting statement that I think is quite provocative of, we've moved beyond the need for Metroid. And,
Yes, I did
and
say
I
that.
yeah, and I think that's a very compelling idea.
Yeah.
Um, and it makes me wonder why I don't agree with it.
Hmm.
And I think the reason I don't agree with it is because when I play Ori and the Blind Forest on your recommendation,
Yeah.
my brain says kind of the inverse of what your brain says, which is, I've seen what Ori does before
Yeah.
in Metroid, not necessarily just because I have played Metroid before,
Hmm.
but because I know that this game would not exist without Metroid.
Of course, absolutely.
And,
Yeah.
and so, how my brain works is it says, yeah, I prefer a lot of later 3D Mario games, but I'm
Hmm.
not necessarily sure any of them are more impressive than Mario 64
Sure,
because
that's totally
I
fair.
because I look at um, the Peach's Castle and I think
Hmm.
to myself, I can't believe they did this.
Yeah.
It's the same with Super Metroid. I can't believe they made Planet Zebes like this.
Hmm.
And I feel in awe in that element
Hmm.
more than
Yeah.
I do looking at the refinement of Ori and the Blind Forest,
Sure, that's
which
totally fair.
I'm pretty sure you can basically pound for pound say it's just better than Super Metroid because it does
Hmm.
everything Super Metroid does with a more fluid control style, more modern structural
Yeah.
tenets,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. I don't even think I would contend on a in a vacuum conversation Super Metroid is better than Ori.
Sure.
But for me, I can't escape the fact that what I am most interested in, frankly, is games as a canon and a tradition and a medium.
Yeah.
And so the remember if we're thinking about oldness as a function of taking ideas of a time period and bringing them somewhere new,
Hmm.
when I contextualize them within that time period, I'm just so impressed
Yeah.
that the negative of me playing Super Metroid and whenever I played it to completion, maybe 2019 or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
that by that point we had Hollow Knight and we had all these things.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't really matter to me because I know, even if it is just mental, even if it is just knowledge based, I wasn't there in
Mm-hmm.
what was it, 95 when Super Metroid came out in that era
Something like that.
in
Yeah.
that area. I still know that that came first.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of oldness
Wait, did Super
from
Metroid come out after Mario 64? Mario 64 was 94, right? Wait,
no,
no, wait. I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay,
I,
continue.
I don't think
I'm
so.
fucking. I'm off my rocker. So,
Yeah.
all right. I'm gonna
The
look up when
point
these games came out. Continue talking.
the point being I
Oh,
really put
96, 96. Okay, my
I
bad.
really put a lot of value on
Yeah,
getting to an idea first.
yeah, sure.
And I think that's a big point of difference between us.
Yeah,
Halo Combat Evolved being another great example. You can play Halo Combat Evolved and see how all of the corridors are very sparse and
yeah,
they're repeating textures in the interior.
hmm
But Combat Evolved got there in 2001.
yeah.
And for me, that's what's interesting, and that's what
Hmm.
makes the game so fun and cool to me.
Hmm.
But that also comes from, in part, the fact that I don't like how most modern games are designed.
Yeah. Hmm.
I can probably put on two hands the number of AAA titles from the past 10 years that I genuinely think are really, really good.
Yeah.
You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So again, this is so subjective, but
Yeah. No,
I'm way
absolutely.
more impressed and interested by what things did in the past than how they're being iterated on in the future.
Yeah. That's I think coming back to what I talked about in terms of contextualization, informing my factual and like
Yeah.
historical perspective on a game or a film or whatever it is, but not informing my personal subjective experience with it. This is kind of the inverse of some of the conversations we've had on Quest of older films. I'm much more experienced and interested in older films from the 30s and 40s and
Yeah.
that have this older styling that are using this kind of acting and this style of editing and this tonal convergence
Yeah.
of comedy and drama and whatever it is. And multiple times on Quest, you've been like,
And I
this
find it
feels old,
boring.
and I find it boring. And absolutely, and I
Yeah.
think that is totally valid. But it is the
Yeah.
inverse of my experience
Yeah.
with games. I do not. I'm not saying that you don't think something like You Can't Take It With You from the 40s isn't an impressive movie for its time, but that
Yeah.
it doesn't engage you subjectively because
Exactly
your
right.
taste has been
Yeah.
informed by growing up in the 2000s, having 70 plus years of fucking movies that have iterated on that. And there's more action and there's more CGI and there's more concepts that go into a lot of your
I love
favorite films of all
CGI.
time. 100%. Yeah, like in Jungle Cruise. But I am the inverse when it comes to games is I am fascinated by the canon of games. There's probably nothing more that I'm passionate about. Games as an art form, games as
Yeah.
a medium, their history, their culture, the industry. That is something that I literally study in my free time because I'm a fucking nerd. But when it
Right.
comes to how I enjoy playing a game, I do think that there is something very strong to my taste being shaped in playing
Of
games
course.
that mostly came out after the year 2012, something like that. Of course,
Yeah.
most of like 90% of my favorite games of all time fit into that category, and I would contend that most of the games that we've gotten today are better than what came before. I'd
Yeah.
say I could pretty confidently contend that Breath of the Wild is better than Ocarina, but only from my subjective opinion. My opinion being my taste being shaped by the fact that was the first Zelda game that I really got into. Something like Odyssey being better than Mario 64 or Sunshine or Galaxy. These are my opinions, but they are shaped by I experienced this first. It really informed what I think this kind of game should do and why I enjoyed this kind of game in this way.
Yeah.
So that when you and I have a conversation about the linearity in Galaxy versus the openness of Odyssey, and you fall on the linear side and I fall on the open side, there's not a one to one, okay, this is superior because of this, but
Right.
it is a difference in your experience of preferring linearity because it feels crafted, or I like to explore and find my own way through a level, and that's more engaging to me. That is, I think, a design element that is shaped by taste. But when it comes to a game feeling old, a game like Super Metroid that I did play after I played Ori, after I played Ori and the Will of the Wisps, these are games that are in my top 10 of all time. I
Yeah.
think they're phenomenal. I go back and play Super Metroid. In the back of my brain, of course, I'm thinking the entire time, wow, this is on Super Nintendo. This is
Yeah.
surprisingly close to modern Metroidvanias in terms of its design, in terms of its visual clarity and the controls, but there's still that element in the back of my mind that I've already played the better version of this, the later version of
Yeah,
this. In my opinion, the better version of this. And I'm going back to a game that is clunkier. Wall jumping in Super Metroid is fucking infuriating.
it's
It is.
awful.
It's a terrible controller.
Shine sparking
And
is awful too.
exactly, yes, the controls of a controller that had less buttons, that had less game design philosophy in history of game design
Yeah,
philosophy in going into making that game. These elements, I'm like, why could this not be better? And then I have to be like, okay, well, it came out a long time ago. But that is a band-aid. It's a justification. It's an excuse that I can't say the
yeah.
band-aid actually like heals what's underneath. Well, okay, it would eventually heal on the band-aid. Maybe bad
The bandit,
example.
but it's a great example because a bandit doesn't. It does fuck all. A
Yeah,
bandit is a piece of. It's a piece of whatever the hell bandits are made out of.
band-aid material. Yeah,
Rubber,
that
horsehair.
doesn't. I hope not. I'm not sure what kind of band-aid you're using, but that doesn't it doesn't heal me thinking, wow, this feels worse, because I do think it feels worse. And when I'm
Yeah,
exploring Planet Zebras, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is impressive for the time, but it just looks like an alien planet. And that's my opinion. That's probably
yeah,
one of the reasons I disconnect from Metroid more so than most people. I think it's just relatively basic alien aesthetic, but I know that there are versions of this that speak to me on a more personal level. The lush environments of something like the Ori games, or the grungy hand drawn aesthetic of something like Hollow Knight. I
yeah,
would rather be in those worlds, primarily because I played those first, and I don't have the experience of being wowed by Super Metroid because I didn't
yeah.
play it first, and I wasn't there when it came out, obviously, but I also didn't play it before those games. And I do think that if I played them in a different order, my taste would be shaped and maybe more aligned with something like someone like you or Bro, who do have a different perspective on those.
Yeah, and I also want to just clarify to be very specific in my point, and it goes back to what we were saying with this idea of oldness not being relegated to just third generation systems, fourth generation, fifth generation, but the idea of like
Mm-hmm.
Twilight Princess feeling old or something.
Yeah.
My favorite era of gaming, as I made a tweet about on Twitter, like ask people if they could only play games for 5 years, which would
Yeah.
they choose? I would choose 2000 to 2005
Yeah.
because to me that is the apex of gaming.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's all been
and
downhill from there. I guess you might think that. Never mind. I made a joke, but you might believe that.
I think I might, in part. Um, Obviously, that's a much more nuanced conversation
Yeah,
to
of
have.
course. Yeah.
But for me, if I were to look across an entire industry wide landscape,
Mm,
I'm most compelled by that general
of
period
course,
of time.
absolutely. Totally
Early
fair.
2000s into the mid 2000s is what's really most interested me. And those games, a lot of those, as you're saying, still do feel old. I think,
Hmm.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm sure a lot of your feelings on Metroid Fusion are similar to your feelings on Super Metroid.
Mm. Yeah, though I do like Fusion quite a
Of,
bit more.
of course. Or Halo Combat Evolved, or
Yeah.
a lot of the games from that time period in particular that I put in my top games of all time
Yeah.
that I love do still feel in large part as though they sort of hinge on
Mm.
older design.
Yeah.
Because, and I'm curious what you think about this, and this is almost sort of a tangential idea entirely, but I think you can basically split this old versus new
Hmm.
game feel idea on a holistic level at the seventh generation.
Okay.
I think that there is a markedly different feeling to how a game plays on a seventh generation system than
Yeah.
it does on a sixth generation one.
Hmm.
For a lot of different reasons. Control is a very interesting one.
Yeah.
Um, you think about playing Halo and Halo Combat Evolved, you push in the right stick
Yeah.
to
Sure.
to go down a sight. A
Hmm.
lot of games, gas might be on triangle. You think about the ways that by seventh generation we're standardizing. You aim down sights with the left trigger, and
Yeah.
obviously I'm saying seventh generation of loose sense because I know like early COD games of that era and Halo
Yeah.
3 and things still have that sixth generation control. So maybe the cutoff is more around like turn of the decade into the 2010s or something. I don't know. It's a loose window, and again, this is where I want your thoughts in the comment section.
Hmm.
But for me, there's a distinct point in which games changed
Mm.
and newness was defined.
Yeah.
Because I think you can play a game that you can, like Atomic Heart is a great example. It's an interpolation of so many design ideas, but it's an interpolation of so many design ideas from like seventh generation forwards.
Yeah.
And it's very rare that you play a game in modernity that feels like a sixth generation title.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting when a game like Hi-Fi Rush comes out and people say, "Man, this feels like a
A
lost PS2
GameCube
game,"
game, yeah, a PS2 game, yeah.
because there's a feel to those titles that, to me, is everything that is old, quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote, about the generations that came before, polished to a level of early 2000s modernity
Yeah.
and early 2000s newness.
Mm-hmm.
But now that is incompatible with contemporary 2023 newness. And I think
Yeah.
that's a newness that we felt for like the last 10, 12 years. You can pick up most games that came out in the seventh generation,
Yeah.
and they're going to play like they came out today.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of going to look like they came out today too.
Sure. Yeah.
Obviously, better ray tracing and textures and everything. But I said a lot. What do you think about what I've rambled on about?
Well, so one of the things that has been sort of percolating in the back of my mind is we're talking about the feeling of newness, the
Yeah,
feeling of oldness, which is something that comes from differences in control, difference in frame rate, speed, in the
yeah,
feel of the controller in your hand with something like Star Fox 64 that you play on the N64 controller. Sorry, I was just trying to visualize it. My mind was so complex that my mind couldn't handle it. And I was trying to think what games from this era, like I mentioned Yoshi's Island, feeling like it was ahead of its time,
yeah,
and I still do think that, but also that game is structured like an older game. I was mostly
yeah.
talking about its visuals, looking like something that an indie creator would have made today. Of course, aping
Sure.
on Yoshi's Island at that point, but that hold up, in my opinion, a lot better than a lot of games that released in that
Yeah,
time period. And for me, oldness comes from um, iteration or the lack of iteration of things, ideas that have been built upon and, in my opinion,
yeah,
surpassed. This was the foundation of something like Combat Evolved, which is obviously one of the first shooters, first person shooter. Yeah, no, not. Yeah, first person. Sorry, I couldn't remember if Halo was first person or third person for a second. First person shooters on a console revolutionized, made Xbox what it is. But those controls, in my opinion, with the games that I've played, something like Overwatch was one of my favorite games of all time, or Wolfenstein 1 and 2, these games that I think have improved on that control wise. The levels are more complex. These elements that Halo 1 couldn't have because it came out a long ass time ago, that feels like it's lacking in those departments. But for me,
yeah,
it is the games that have not been iterated on that do feel like they hold up better to this day. And I'm looking at my years lists from those earlier times. Something like Pikmin 1 and 2. Those games came out in that time period, but
yeah.
the only game that has really informed that those games have informed the design of is Pikmin 3, which I think we both agree is the better game. But
Yes.
that those games still feel new because I haven't played 100 games like Pikmin 1 and 2. I've played
Yeah.
3 games like Pikmin 1 and 2. But I've played dozens of games like Halo 1. And when I'm playing Halo 1, I'm like, I feel like I've seen this before, but I feel like I've seen it better. I've played first person shooters in Overwatch. I've
Yeah.
used like Soldier's Assault Rifle, which is pretty similar to like a COD Assault Rifle or something like that. Um, or I'm looking at some of my other lists, something like Loco Roco, a game that came out in 2006, and that's around that era that you're talking about. But
Yeah.
there's still nothing like Loco Roco. Loco Roco 2, maybe. Even the other Loco Roco games like Kokoreko and Midnight Cardinal, those are nothing like the original Loco Roco games. And so for me, when I go back to older games, what I'm looking
Yeah.
for are games that feel unique, even to someone who has played games that came out 25 years after and that have not been iterated upon a ton. And
Yeah.
maybe that's a difference in, of course, Ocarina of Time or Mario 64 or Halo 1 are influential. They are iconic, they are influential, and of course, people are taking inspiration from those. Something like Pikmin or Loco Roco games that I love didn't go on to be 20 plus entry series and multimedia franchises and inform the game design tenets of dozens and dozens and dozens of other franchises. And that, I think, is the distinction for me. Is I'm looking for something that
That's interesting.
experientially feels new.
Yeah.
Experientially, Super Metroid is similar to what I've played that came after it. I've already played
Sure.
Ori and the Blind Forest. I've already played Overwatch when I played Halo Combat Evolved. And so experientially, I'm like, this is a shooter. I have played a shooter before. I've played a shooter that has more complex animations, that has more complex shooting
Yeah.
mechanics, that fits my modern sensibility of what a control scheme is a little bit better. And so when I go back to something like Super Metroid or Halo Combat Evolved, I'm like, yeah, I've seen this before. And I feel like I've seen it better.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to another point that I've sort of realized about my own taste in a lot of ways, is that I don't really like games that are especially complicated.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just it's a very subjective thing.
Hmm.
But like I've wanted to play Disco Elysium for a very long time, and I got it for
Yeah,
Christmas, and I started playing Disco Elysium. I'm like, there's too much going on
yeah.
for me,
Hmm.
and 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 I don't just mean necessarily on a systems level, although I usually mean that. It's part of the
Yeah.
reason why a lot of modern design philosophy doesn't work for me because I don't want to level anything up. You
Hmm.
know,
Yeah, yeah,
I don't want to have to like do a lot of the stuff that for a lot of modern players adds to their enjoyment.
yeah,
Part of why I love Combat Evolved is because it's simple
yeah.
in a lot of respects, and it gains complexity from the ways you come to understand the levels design more as you play the game more times,
Hmm.
and the ways you come to learn the interplay between the weapons, and you notice new things, and you
Yeah,
improve the movement and the shooting and everything. That's the kind of complexity I like. So that's another
yeah.
really important part of this conversation.
Distinction. Yeah,
Yeah, because it's like I play Red Dead Redemption 2, and I'm like, there's just literally too much going on in this game for it to be interesting
yeah,
to me. And I think part of the reason that draws me to that 2000s period is that there, and part of what keeps me so in love with Nintendo today
yeah.
is that simplicity that still has depth to it is what I'm always looking for.
Sure. Yeah. Mm.
And and so when you say like, oh, you've played shooters more complex and Combat Evolves, I have too, because
Yeah. Of course you. Of course you have.
I love first person shooters and I play a
Yeah.
lot of them. But at a certain point, they become more complicated than I want them to be.
That's fair. Yeah.
And I think about this is a point that Chris Raygun made
Hmm.
when talking about Halo that I've never been able to unsee, and I think it's such a salient point, and it really unlocked something for me in my head. Of in Halo 4, Master Chief, when he presses a switch, reaches out his hand and pushes the button.
Yeah.
When you play Combat Evolved through Halo 3 and Reach, when you need to push a button, you press right bumper and the door just opens. There's no
Yeah.
animation of your hand reaching out.
Maybe the button goes in or like it
Right.
lights up a little bit.
There's no
I
moment.
played enough. I played enough games like
Yeah.
I don't know, Half-Life 1 where you press E to interact with the button and the button goes and
Yeah.
that's it.
There's no moment like at the beginning of Halo 4 when you wake up from cryo freeze and you're in a cinematic moment like climbing up an elevator shaft and you're like
Yeah.
as Master Chief doing like a micro Uncharted set piece.
Hmm.
To me, that is a sort of way that we've been conditioned around this feeling of newness,
Yeah.
a feeling of newness being more cinematic,
Hmm.
being more engaged. New is having to manage Arthur Morgan's beard length.
Is that a
New,
thing?
yeah, that's the thing in
I
Red
knew
Dead
about
2.
like the horse. No, I knew the horse balls. What was the other thing? Like you
Horses
got to
shit
manage
a
a lot of
lot.
shit in that game.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but 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 even that, I guess, was sort of begun to be foregrounded in like the later sixth gen GTA games. But on the
Yeah.
whole, newness has become more about ease and immersion and a lot
Yeah.
of ideas
Absolutely.
that for me don't feel new as much as they feel like they get between me and a game.
Hmm.
And there's a certain texture
Hmm.
to oldness that feels more timeless to me. Because
Hmm.
when I don't have to stop and be taken out of the action to push a button or
Yeah.
all these little things, or I don't need to wait and spend 5 hours of my game being tutorialized or any of this
Hmm.
stuff, that speaks more to me.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
yeah,
kind of the point.
I think that is
Yeah.
totally valid. It's something I've never
Yeah.
really thought about on that granular of a level, but I do think that it's something that can't be said either way if it's a net positive or a net negative, or if this is a
Not
good
yeah.
change or a bad
Yeah,
change.
not making
I
any
would
claim on that
say
front.
I would say on like a industry level, obviously enough people enjoy that has trended towards that way. So
Yeah.
maybe in that like numbers sense, you could say that it is a positive change for most people. But on an experiential level, something like like not seeing that animation of Halo 4, which by the way I have not played Halo 4, so I don't even know what that animation looks like.
I
I can
actually really
imagine.
think, as a sidebar, you might like Halo 4 and Halo 5.
Maybe. Still gotta play 3. Um, but is that you say that it takes you out of the experience? But for me, I'm imagining myself playing Halo 4. It's not a very good game, but whatever. It's Halo, so it's not good.
I agree
But
with you. Halo 4 is fine.
but is that the idea of knowing that Master Chief is a character in a place, and of course he's
Yeah.
going to reach out his hand and press the button because he is a he's a person. He's
Yeah.
interacting with this environment that he's in, rather than the button is pushed by nothing and it goes in and then the door opens. That is a immersion that I would contend. Again, I have not played Halo 3 or Halo 4, but I played enough games where there are contextual animations, say like in Last of Us 2, which has like some of the craziest contextual
Yes.
animations of all time. Ellie and Abby like doing this to like open all the drawers.
Hmm.
That is something that immerses me more in the
Yeah.
game rather than taking it out. And I like games that take a break from the action, that give me a cinematic set piece, that flow in and out of cutscene
Yeah.
and gameplay, because that's something that allows me to know this is a real world with characters that I am engaged to be in. It is less gamey in that sense because cinematics have become more popular. Immersing the player in that way has become more popular. But for me, that keeps me locked into the game world in a different way. It's not
Yeah.
my hands are on the sticks and I'm immersed because I'm continuing to play. It's not broken by like interaction, but in terms of experience, I would say that immersion increases my want to be in this world. And lacking that, it feels like it feels old. It feels antiquated. It feels like, hold on, this is missing. Why is
Yeah.
Halo Chief? Oh my god! Why is Master Chief's hand not reaching out to press this button? He's a person, right? Wouldn't he need to push the button for the button to be pushed? And in that way, it's like, okay, hold on, no. This is a chunk of the game that I know can be improved and has been improved. And improved, of course, is subjective. If you don't
Yeah.
want to see his hand, but yeah, what do you think about that? Of that actually being a different kind of immersion?
I think what it comes down to is is whether you want your games to get closer to our world or if you want your games to take you further from ours. And I mean, not even
Hmm.
necessarily on a theme level, but kind of just like on a larger philosophical level.
Yeah, continue. Sorry, I was just making a
Yeah.
face.
And again, I want to make clear for anyone that might be watching might not know my taste. While I feel this way, there are no doubt clear exceptions. I mean, Last of Us and Last of Us Part 2 are, in my opinion, not only in my top 10 games of all time, but I think they're maybe in the top 7 best games ever made,
Yeah,
right?
I would agree. I would agree.
And I think you make a really good point about the direction of the industry moving and it being
Hmm.
interesting to people and people wanting to feel as though their worlds are more real.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean in terms of visual fidelity, when
Hmm.
obviously a lot of people want photorealism. But I think also just in the sense that a world is coherent and close to ours and how it moves and looks.
Yeah.
Um, but for me, I don't really care about that.
Hmm.
I care more about a game letting me play it than I do about the game constructing a situation wherein there's a logic and a sense of cinematic to everything that happens.
Yeah. Sure.
And because I made this joke to you that I had a existential crisis when I started Forbidden West the other day because I was like, why don't I just
Did you
I'm
actually start it, or did you think about starting it?
no, I started it, but
Oh,
in
really?
the Abram Biener way, I played it for about 10 minutes. And I'm like, I'm just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And the reason, and where I definitely am separated from a lot of people that play games, is I do not want, unless the experience is very particularly predicated on feeling grounded, a la The Last of Us.
Hmm.
I don't want the game to begin with 5 minutes of cutscenes, and then I don't want
Yeah.
to be led around by some Tom, Dick, and Harry who's
Hmm.
telling me about the lore of the world.
Sure. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I don't want to be told how to craft something, and I don't want to
Hmm.
be told what button makes me jump, and I don't want to be
Yeah.
told any of this,
Mhm.
and I don't want to level anything up, and I don't want to walk around. What I want to do is I want to shoot a fucking dinosaur
Yeah.
made out of servos with a bow and arrow.
Yeah.
And I think that if Horizon came out in 2004,
Mm-hmm.
none of that would be in the game, and it would be a
Of
very
course
it'd
not.
be a
Yeah.
very different experience,
Yeah.
but it would be an experience that gets me to the heart of what I find interesting about Horizon faster. But
Mm-hmm.
I would never contend that is the way that most people want to play their games.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the fact that Aloy and uh, uh, Atreus give you puzzle answers
Yeah.
is a testament to the fact that PlayStation knows from playtesting and heat mapping, as they're talking about sacred symbols, that people want the answers. People want to be told what's going on. They want to be shepherded through. They want hand holding. They want the mechanics spoon fed to them. They want all this stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
And I do enjoy some games that are in that style. But for the
Yeah.
most part, there's almost this sense, and this is going to sound really interesting, I think, to you in particular.
Okay.
There's a sense that, for me, a new game can feel too new. Just as for you, an old game can feel old,
Sure. Sure.
as a
Oh, I see
pejorative,
what you're saying.
as a
Yes.
pejorative, for me, a new game can feel too new.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that can immediately turn me off from playing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those are that. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a fascinating philosophical conversation about games.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my favorite games of all time list,
Yeah.
and I'm looking at games that span the spectrum in terms of I mean, they're mostly new, but there are some older games on there. I
Yeah.
love games like Banjo Kazooie and Katamari Damacy, but also games in the
Can
modern
I
era.
stop you for a second? When you say an older game, what's kind of like a temporal cutoff, just so I have a sense of what you're talking? Because to me, Banjo Kazooie and Katamari are pretty far apart.
Yeah,
So
I mean they literally they're like exactly 10 years apart, I think, or a little less than that. But I guess, and frankly, because
yeah,
this is where my mind became fucking cognizant.
yeah,
2012 to now. 2012,
okay,
I'd say, like in my mind, 2012
sure,
is when I like became the person that I am. Like before that, it's some guy that I see in like videotapes and pictures. Who's that little
yeah, yeah,
squeaker kid? But since then, that is when I started playing games more frequently. I like there's
okay,
like a sharp increase in like 2012 movies versus like 2010 movies that I'd seen
yeah,
or games or whatever. And most of my favorite games of all time come from 2012 to now, from that decade of games. That's
okay, that makes
where I've
sense.
been. That's where I've been a human being. Before that, who the hell
Okay,
knows?
I'm just
So
curious.
yes, that's an important distinction. It also that is something that I think informs this conversation in like an entirely like philosophical different way of like
Yeah,
us as people and what we experience first and what like our minds can perceive as old or
yeah,
new is based on when we were born, and that's something that we cannot change. And I think that's something that people kind of have a hard time reconciling. Of is this better? Is this not? Like kids born 2 years ago are gonna, or like let's say 10 years ago, their first game that they like really got into is gonna be Fortnite, and that's gonna shape the way that they love games and play games and what game design tenets they do. And then people like you are gonna be like, these kids, that's not a that's not a game you want informing your games. But hey, there are people that would say that about the games that informed, particularly my taste. You're a little bit crankier and older in your fucking taste. But I'm again returning to my thing. The list of my favorite games mostly is new games, as I said, but it does
yeah,
span the spectrum in terms of complexity to simplicity. A game like the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is basically as simple as interaction of a video game as you can
yeah,
get. It is walking around and one button input. But for me, that game is so immersive because it does such interesting things with game design. But at the same time, even though mechanically it is very simple, it is very new in terms of its themes, in terms of potential of game
yes,
design. And I think that for me, I would rather have an arcade style game, a platformer style game, a game that is taking elements from older games, but with the polish and design nuance that comes with decades of extra design
yeah,
philosophy, experimentation. There have
like
been
Point P.
exactly what I was going to get to that is a high score arcade game. Well, there's an end, but
I wish it
ostensibly
was
it's
a high
that.
score arcade game. It's my only flaw with the game.
Um, is that game I love that game.
Me
But I
too.
love that game because it's a high score game that I can take out of my pocket and play whenever I want it to.
Yeah,
Not something that is I have to sit down in front of my NES or stand at an arcade cabinet to play and play and play and play and put quarters in and restart the NES console to get good at it. But with Point B, it is more mechanically immersive because I'm using my finger on the screen. That is something that can only come since the era that touch games have become a thing. It has the haptic feedback of your phone, which I think is fantastic in point view,
Yeah.
and that makes it experientially something that I want to be immersed in because it's giving that little motorized feedback. Something that the NES didn't have a rumble controller. Um, Arcade cabinets didn't have that. So I'm even though it's designed like an old game in terms of its structure, it
Yeah.
has the modern affordances that allow someone like me to want to be immersed in that kind of world. I also look at something like Thomas Was Alone, a game that is uh, just as simple of a platformer mechanic wise. It's just jumping. Then comparing to most things, even back in like the NES days.
Yeah.
But I gravitate towards that because it has a story philosophy that engages me more to even simpler visual design than something like Mario Bros. Or Mario 3 or whatever. This is Thomas Alone is the simplest looking game you can literally get, except for I guess Pong, but it's actually basically on the same level as Pong. Um, but that's telling a story about these simple characters that can only come from having years of game design behind it because it's a little bit meta about interacting with computers and AI and game design, like going to the left versus the right or whatever it is. Modern game design, I think, is a little bit more than just adding complexity to things.
Yeah.
I think it can be polishing things that started back in the day, but in my opinion, polish is a good thing. And that is the reason why I say, hey, I'm playing Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, and yeah, mechanically, it's about on the same level as the 40 other Ratchet and Clank games before it, but experientially, the visual fidelity, the haptic feedback, the jumping through the rifts in the titular Rift from Rift Apart, that makes me want to be in that world and immerse in that world in a different
Yeah.
way. That also doesn't really hamper the engagement as much. Like that's a very fast thing that I think really uses the SSD technology to its best. But there are a number of examples where I like games that are at face value designed old, but it's those nuances that newer game design has allowed for that I think do improve, at least for me and experientially, on what games before have done. So when I go back to play
Yeah.
games before that, I'm like, this is a high score game, but I have to stand in an arcade cabinet to do it. This is an action platformer, but I gotta restart the level and or restart the game or collect lives to keep going. That is something that we have moved past, and those feel like hindrances for me with the game. Having lives or a high focus on a high score or kicking back to the beginning of the game, these are things that keep me from being immersed in the game. Castlevania, you run out of life, you have to restart the entire game. That is something that stops me from wanting to play that makes me feel like the game doesn't want me to play it. And that is something that is entirely opposite of what some other people have in their game design experience. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because it's almost like for me, I don't want a game to want me to play it too much. I like
You want it to play hard to get.
I wanted to play hard to get with me.
Oh God.
um, I don't want it to like push me to the end, and I don't want
Yeah.
unless it's like Destiny, and I can't even fucking get behind Destiny anymore because that game is way too goddamn complicated than when I used to play it in
Yeah.
Destiny 1.
Back in the good old days.
I don't even think that's true. I think I can't with Destiny anymore.
Yeah, that's fair.
I don't want to I don't want a welcome message. I don't want a fucking login bonus. I don't want any of this. And I
Sure.
want to
Yeah.
be very clear that a lot of the issues I have with games feeling too new are basically aimed at Western AAA game dev.
100%. Yeah.
Because part of the reason why I love Nintendo, there's a lot of reasons why I love Nintendo, and that could be a completely different and interesting
I'll write
conversation.
that down.
Um, no, like, 'cause obviously I love the characters and the worlds make me just feel happy and a lot of things. But as you're saying, and I think you really well articulated the sort of modern game that I do like,
Yeah.
is when it is struck or is sort of philosophically drawing upon older eras of design,
Yeah.
but cleaning those up. I think you're totally
Yes,
right, and I think
yes.
that's exactly what Nintendo does,
Sure. Absolutely.
with rare exception. But I think that's what they do. They
What would
make
you
games.
say the exception is there?
Well, if you talk about things that they also publish, I think, well, Fire Emblem, we can't even really say Fire Emblem because Fire Emblem's old, but that's because of the fact that there's old games I don't like too. I think actually, you can make an argument maybe for Splatoon, being super new feeling,
I
but
would agree with that. Yeah,
not to its detriment.
but also
The
because
more I,
that's like their
yeah,
like only new franchise.
the more I think about this point, I think maybe there might not be a single Nintendo series that feels to use the
Pejoratively
Abram
too new.
Buhner
Yes.
barometer, the pejorative of too new.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate that, and it's part of the reason why I love a lot of indie games.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
Ojiro Furumoto's titles, Downwell and Point P, are brilliant examples of that.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's a really salient point.
Yeah.
I also really love your point about um, modern systemic affordances.
Hmm.
Now, for me, part of what makes me disinterested in emulation a lot of the
Hmm.
time is because I like the feel of hardware.
Yeah. Absolutely. So do I.
And I think there's something to be said for the ways in which sometimes these modern collections or things or emulation kind of gets us away from that
Yeah.
too much. But there's also something to be said, I think, as you're saying, that there are techniques within certain collections, within a service like NSO, within the Switch itself, that make old games feel new
Hmm.
because they're not in the cabinet or
Yes.
because they're not
Yes.
on the original hardware. And a brilliant example, and the game that teases closer and closer to my favorite of all time every time I play it, which is Tetris Effect.
Hmm.
Um, that obviously has always been on handheld and console or whatever, but it's very
Yeah.
arcade esque. But there's
Well, not
something to
before
be
the Game
said,
Boy came out and it was only a PC game, but
yeah.
only available in Russia.
In Russia, I'm very excited to watch that Tetris movie. I didn't
So
realize
am
that was
I.
coming out this month. By the way, that's
Yeah, it is.
crazy.
Yeah.
I thought it was a while away.
Apple TV Plus. Let's go.
That thing that I actually think I pay for
Why? For
because
what?
I had to watch Ted Lasso
You
for
don't even own an Apple
class.
product.
No, but you can use it in your browser. I had to watch Ted Lasso for the history of TV class, and then I forgot to cancel it, and I still don't think I ever canceled it.
Oh,
And this is
well, that was
like
a while ago.
4 or 5
Whatever.
months ago.
Continue.
You can now play Tetris Effect in vertical mode, which I love.
Yeah.
But an even more critical example, you can now play Ikaruga in vertical mode on Switch,
Yeah.
and that's interesting because Ikaruga was first on like GameCube. It might have come to Sega first, but I think it was GameCube. No, it must have been Sega first, then GameCube. But either way, that was always trying to emulate the arcade experience
Yeah.
on home console. But now you can basically do it so seamlessly just by flipping your Switch vertical.
Yeah.
Now, I have also played Ikaruga by taking my computer monitor, turning it sideways, leaning it against my PS5, and propping the base against a pillow
Yeah.
to play vertical on a bigger screen.
Hmm.
But vertical mode on Switch, rewind in NSO,
Yeah.
save states for emulation, various things. Even if sometimes they get me a little bit away from that feeling of authenticity I really like,
Yeah.
they give you such a great entry point into this hardware,
Hmm.
or sorry, through the hardware into those old games.
Yeah.
And I think that can't be taken for granted either.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why I have such a reverence for this design philosophy is, as you were saying about Ninja Gaiden, I don't have to worry about the elements that do still feel old in a
Yes.
negative way.
Yeah. Even to someone as cranky as you. Yeah.
Even as someone as cranky as me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Pejorative.
Pejorative, of course. There's another point I want to touch on, but is there any point you want to touch on?
No, that you responded to my point. Now you
Okay.
get a question. Allow it.
I wrote a piece before Retroware, may rest in peace, uh,
Oh.
um, shuttered, about Pikmin 1,
Yeah.
specifically the first 10 minutes of Pikmin 1.
Hmm.
Because I was mentioning about
That is the most hyper specific article I've ever heard of. The only
Yes.
thing you get more specific is like the opening, like 3 seconds.
Right. And I think the fact that I basically anything like that was getting commissioned with wanton disregard might be why Retroware shut down. So I'm sorry that this was the piece that I was
Here's
writing for you.
$50 to write this.
Oh, brother, they were paying me more than that to write about the first 10 minutes of Pikmin 1. Which is
I try to
crazy.
lowball it, I guess. Oh, God.
What I love about those moments is that is to me the perfect level of modern tutorialization.
Pikmin 1.
It's, yeah.
Okay.
you crash. And you're in that first day is a tutorial. You don't even have the day, like the time progression. It
No,
doesn't
yeah,
even
doesn't
happen
start
on the
yet. Yeah.
first day. You have to find the first ship part. There are no enemies. Is there a bullet orb? I don't think there's even a bullet orb. Not until you land in the first area. They're just the number of Pikmin you need to grab, an environmental puzzle to solve.
Well, there is an enemy, but it's an area you can't reach. Remember that? Because you can come back and fight the little mini boss. This is the goo guy. Remember the goo guy?
That's a great point. Um, and in universe, Olimar through his captain's log says, "Oh, these Pikmin, they're so interesting. I'm a scientist, so I'm going to take scientific notes." And
Yeah.
almost speaks to the player through these scientific notes about like, "Oh, I wonder if I hit the A button, if I could pluck one from the ground and things like that."
Yeah.
You're in and out of tutorial in 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
It's in universe. It's it's as predicated on you physically going through the motions of solving challenges to learn the mechanics as it is about Olimar reading them out to you.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love a game to spend as little time as humanly possible telling me what to do. That's why Breath of the Wild is amazing, and
That's another great example. Yeah.
Why Arlo is so wrong about the idea that Breath of the Wild 2, or I guess now we know it as Tears of the Kingdom, should have like a level scaling enemy system and like more RPG involved mechanics and things. I've always disagreed about that because what I love about that game, but also Pikmin, is that they never break me out of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I learn the mechanics in a traditionally old school way of by doing.
Yeah.
But there's also still the modern notion of storytelling,
Mm.
and it's in
Yeah.
universe storytelling. So I'm curious for you, as somebody who does prefer more modern sensibility,
Mm-hmm.
is there no feeling of broken immersion when a game slows itself in its opening minutes or hours to a crawl to
Mm-hmm.
feed you full of information or feed you full of control
Yeah.
help or tutorial areas? Does that not affect your enjoyment of a game?
Um, Conceptually, yes, it does. And that is
Yeah,
because I've played a bazillion video games and I know
right.
what each button does and I know how
Yeah,
this kind of game and this genre is going to play as soon as I start it. And I already knew 3 months ago how I was going to play because I watched all the trailers and like
right.
I know how that works. But I think I give games the benefit of the doubt in
Yeah,
those areas because even though I don't love walking through a crowd of people as it says, hey, pushing the right stick forward makes your character move, or moving or other left stick makes your character move, right stick makes you look side to side.
yeah,
Even though I don't love that, those games balance it in an interesting way of usually the openings to games, even if interaction wise are not fascinating, storytelling wise, I think it's a much better way to get me
yeah,
immersed in a world when it's given these cinematic affordances of showing a ton of people slowly walking through this world to really let me drink in this thing rather than in a different way of a game of letting me just like run the other direction or not look at what they want to show me or just like break off and fuck around and like crouch doing whatever I want. Those elements are a way that you could be more immersed in the game because there is more interactivity, but it also is going against the game introducing itself to you. It's a
yeah,
gentle introduction. It's shaking your hand saying, hey, welcome in, welcome to my game. You're going to walk around, you're going to watch a cutscene, you're going to learn a little about these characters, and then we're going to let you go. And I
yeah,
think that pro outweighs the con for me. Is no, I know what moving the left stick does. I know what pressing square is going to do. That's going to make me reload. But I also know, and I think this is why I don't even factor that in at all, is that comes from my experience. Not everyone who plays
absolutely.
every game has that experience. If you
Yeah,
put a controller for Last of Us Part 2 in the hands of someone who has not played a third person action adventure game before, they might not necessarily know what the triggers are going to do, what the triangle
yeah,
button is going to do. They might intuitively figure out that the sticks are going to move your character, but teaching, I don't think it's fair to assume that every person is going to know what to do
yeah,
when you put them on the game. And so I understand from a game design point, it needs to be inclusive in that way. It needs to understand that
yeah,
whether it's 30 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that you need to introduce a game in a slower way in the modern era because there are hundreds of thousands more people playing games. And even 1,000 of those is the first game they've ever played. That's 1,000 players you need to introduce the game to. And so I
yeah,
understand from that point, but also when I think about a game, it's not usually the opening areas that I'm in love with, which can be seen as a negative. Of yeah,
Yeah.
you should have your opening minutes of a game be really grab you, but the experience of a game comes from evolving itself. I don't even think about those first few minutes in Pikmin 1. They're the introduction, but I don't have combat yet. I don't have multiple Pikmin types. I'm not
Yeah.
exploring an area in a different way because it is so compact. And so, even though that is a good in world tutorial, it's less memorable to me than something like the introduction to Last of Us 2 that is showing me this big open area and I'm riding on the horse with Tommy or whatever it is. No, yes, yes, yeah. No, I'm trying to remember the beginning of Last of Us 2. That is a more immersive and engaging intro to a game rather than one that is, yes, more mechanically involved, but
Yeah.
from an experience level, I would rather have the game shake my hand and say welcome in rather than dropping me in and doing it in that way. And there's pros and cons to both, but I do think that understanding the design that goes into a cinematic opening to a game is something that I would feel hesitant of.
Yeah, no, you're totally right, and that's part of the the too new quality of a lot of games for me.
Yeah.
Because I think that we're now in an environment wherein games are so mainstream that decisions have to be made in service of, as you're saying, the notion that every game that releases is going to be somebody's either first game or more likely first entry point into your series.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's part of why a lot of games are going to be reintroducing you to characters you might know so intimately as you begin because they have to.
Yeah.
Somebody's playing. I'm playing DMC 5, and I've not played DMC 4. So
Yeah.
you got to let people know the lay of the land a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And something that's important. But I think it's also just, for me, there's just such a value to intuiting things and being asked to just intuit stuff.
Yeah.
Because what then makes Pikmin's first 10 minutes even better for me is that the 11th minute is just the gameplay of Pikmin.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? In the sense of wherein you might spend a long time. I'll use just Atomic Heart again because it's a really salient example.
God,
Of,
that game has a long intro. That game is like a 35-minute intro before you get your first gun.
It's awful.
I played the first 90 minutes of that game, by the way, and I dropped it. I'm like, I'm not doing this.
Yeah, I figured. I'm not going to play anymore either. I just taking time away
you don't
from
need
it.
to go on that, but
Yeah. But
long
so
intro, perfect example of a new game, long ass intro, cinematic. You're walking so fucking
Yeah.
slowly through this beautifully rendered world, but
It's
there's
beautiful.
nothing going on.
And it's not even just that. And now that you've played it, you'll empathize with this idea of, okay, I made it through the cinematic.
Yeah.
Now I'm in a sequence wherein I don't even have the bones of all of my powers. You know what
Not
I
even
mean?
close. Yeah.
Whereas in Pikmin, even though the game doles out more Pikmin types and more complicated enemies and puzzles to solve,
Mm-hmm.
as soon as you land in Valley of Hope, I think is the first area of Pikmin 1.
Sure. Let's go with that.
But I've played them all so interchangeably that I don't remember.
The Garden
exactly
of
which
Hope
it
is from 3.
I'm getting them confused.
In the Valley of the Gods.
And
That
how
game's
green?
not happening. How green was my valley?
How green is my valley? Whereas as soon as you finish those first 10 minutes, the 11th minute is just you're playing Pikmin.
Of course. Yeah.
You're just plucking all the Pikmin you want. You're fighting Bulborbs. You're collecting ship pieces. You're just playing the game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas in Atomic Heart, it's cinematic. Now I got to walk around. Now I got to get my axe. Now I got to get my gun.
Mm-hmm.
Now I got to get my power. Now I'm playing Atomic Heart.
Yeah.
And it's been an hour and a half, and I've been assaulted by a vending machine. The vending machine wants to fuck me. I don't want to fuck the vending machine.
Well, speak for yourself.
So yeah, I think this is just such a multifaceted and interesting conversation. But I think I don't think I have any more points I want to raise. Do you?
No, I think I'm good.
I think the utility in this for me is, I think it really clarified something that I didn't quite have ability to articulate before, which is this idea of games feeling too new for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it almost puts a nice reductive, but a nice like spark notes version of part of our ideological difference when it comes to playing games. Of for me, a game can feel too new. For you, a game can feel too old.
Yeah,
and I think that's quite interesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
And very valuable. And so I'm again, comment, join Discord. We have these conversations in Discord all the time. Mm-hmm. Tucker's going to say something about the nature of perspective. I'm gonna. I
Veins
don't know.
bulging my neck as I resist trying to say it.
I'll probably say something unhelpful. You and bro get into a conversation.
Yep,
Somebody come and be the fourth voice.
absolutely. Well, okay. Well, there's other people in there, but yes, yeah, absolutely. Maybe one of our best conversations of all time. We're going to try to have more of these kind of philosophical conversations about games, game design, our opinions on them. But again, we want this to be a community thing. We want this like we want you to listen to our perspectives. Me siding with the hope and the glory of new games, and Abram siding with a couple old dusty men. But we want to know where your game design history comes from. Which games shaped your taste in games? Which games feel too old to you, and why? Which games feel too new to you, and why? Are there examples that we gave that fit that, or that you disagree with? I'd love to hear the differences, because I know that everything I've said here is totally and possibly subjective, and like it is shaped by when I was born and which games I played first, and that's not something that I can change, and it's not something I can make an excuse for, because it's not something that's wrong with me or wrong with someone else. So God, I love doing shit like this. I did just check, there are 3 games on my top 100 from before the year 2000, and only like 10 from before the year 2010. So I was very close to my numbers there on that. But I think maybe we could do another part of this conversation at some point with my favorite old games, because I think that drilling into certain elements of these games is very fascinating in terms of
Yeah,
what feels new or old. But thank you for listening.
you're welcome.
No, I didn't mean you. No, wait, no, you were
Wait,
talking.
wait, 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 wait.
No, wait. No, no, no.
There's a smell in my dorm right now that
A smelly smell. Do you smell the smelly smell?
I went to lunch. I was gone for half an hour. I came back and it smelled like somebody had put a package of cigarettes in a trash can full of rotten food and set the whole thing on fire.
Jesus Christ. That might be one of the most foul things I've heard.
Are you ready?
Oh, that was me. Sorry. I put my cigarette package in a garbage can and mailed it to
I'll
you.
put my cigarette package in your garbage can.